By the latter half of 1940, with the unexpected, swift conquest of France complete and the British defying all expectations by refusing to surrender and successfully resisting the aerial onslaught, the strategic focus of the German leadership irrevocably shifted eastward. This monumental turn was not simply a tactical decision born of military necessity following the failed air campaign against Britain. It was the ultimate, uncompromising expression of the deeply rooted ideology that had defined the entire Nazi movement from its very inception. The decision to invade the Soviet Union, a vast and formidable land power, was not a mere military operation, but an existential imperative rooted firmly in Adolf Hitler's long-held ambition for territorial expansion and absolute racial domination. This operation, a complete and cynical betrayal of the 1939 non-aggression agreement, was codenamed Operation Barbarossa and was poised to ignite the single largest, most brutal military confrontation in human history, fundamentally altering the entire course of the global war. The very foundation of the entire operation rested upon the grotesque racial and geopolitical concept known as living space, the direct translation of the core German term, as Hitler had meticulously detailed in his writings and numerous political speeches over the preceding decades. He was fanatically convinced that the racially superior German people, the German nation, required immense, agriculturally rich territories in Eastern Europe to sustain a future 1,000-year empire. This necessary, unprecedented expansion was predicated upon the immediate, brutal extermination or total enslavement of the native Slavic and Baltic populations, whom the Nazi regime universally deemed racially subhuman and a barrier to German destiny. For Hitler, the Soviet Union represented the ultimate ideological nemesis, the very embodiment of the alleged conspiracy between Jewish and communist forces, a conspiracy the Nazis referred to as Jewish Bolshevism. The destruction of the Soviet state was thus conceived not merely as a military conquest to gain land. It was regarded as an indispensable, essential act of racial purification and political cleansing. This intense, pervasive ideological hatred meant that the entire Eastern campaign was planned and subsequently executed as a war of annihilation designed to be fought without any regard for established international laws of war or basic human decency. The infamous military orders, such as the directive targeting political officers and the immediate deployment of specialized mobile killing squads alongside the German army, underscored the true murderous intent from the very moment the plans were finalized. Beyond this profound ideological fury, acute strategic and economic necessities provided immediate and immense urgency for the attack. The massive rearmament programs and the subsequent war campaigns in Poland and Western Europe had severely strained the entire German economy, leaving the nation desperately short of crucial raw materials, most notably oil and grain. The vast, incredibly fertile plains of Soviet Ukraine were viewed by German economic planners as the essential breadbasket, utterly vital for providing the necessary food supplies to feed the entire empire and its conquering armies indefinitely. Simultaneously, the desperately needed oil reserves, absolutely critical to fuel the motorized army and the powerful air force for prolonged global conflict, lay in the Soviet Caucasus region, specifically the renowned Baku oil fields. The very terms of the previous non-aggression agreement, which had temporarily guaranteed German raw material imports from the East, were now perceived by Hitler as an unacceptable, strategically vulnerable dependency on a deeply despised ideological enemy. To truly become an unassailable global power, Germany had to violently seize and permanently secure these indispensable resources within its own vastly expanded territory, achieving true economic self-sufficiency. Finally, there was the critical element of preemptive action. Despite the outward appearance of political cooperation maintained by the existing non-aggression pact, both the German and Soviet leaderships viewed their alliance as strictly temporary, cynical, and ultimately tactical. German military planners harbored a deep and growing fear that the Soviet Union was rapidly exploiting the temporary peace to aggressively industrialize and mass enormous military strength along the German frontier. Intelligence reports, whether fully accurate or influenced by political paranoia, continually fueled Hitler's conviction that a powerful, aggressive Soviet war machine would eventually pose an existential threat to Germany's eastern flank. Hitler became utterly convinced that he must strike first and decisively to secure the strategic initiative before the Soviet industrial and military strength grew too formidable to overcome. By eliminating the Soviet Union, Hitler also hoped to achieve the final, ultimate strategic goal, removing the last great land power that might interfere with his long-term plans for world domination and, thus, forcing the isolated Britain to finally seek peace once its last continental hope was extinguished. This terrifying confluence of racial fanaticism, economic greed, and preemptive strategy locked the Third Reich onto the catastrophic trajectory toward the invasion of the East. The foundational premise for the entire Eastern campaign rested upon the cynical, calculated act of destroying the non-aggression agreement signed between Germany and the Soviet Union in August 1939. This pact, which had astonished the world by momentarily uniting to bitter ideological enemies, was never intended by either side to be a lasting treaty of friendship. It was, rather, a temporary, tactical agreement allowing each power to pursue immediate strategic gains without the burden of a two-front war. For Hitler, the pact secured the eastern flank during the invasions of Poland and Western Europe, and guaranteed vital raw material imports. For Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, the agreement secured a large buffer zone of annexed territory and bought precious time which he desperately needed and believed he was using effectively to rapidly industrialize and modernize the Soviet military apparatus throughout the late months of 1940 and the early spring of 1941. The relationship between the two nations, though outwardly cordial and maintained through the continuation of resource transfers, became increasingly strained and fraught with mutual suspicion. German demands for raw materials, particularly vast quantities of grain, oil, and metals, became insistent and aggressive, straining Soviet capacity. Simultaneously, the two powers were engaged in tense, often contradictory, diplomatic maneuvers over shared interests in the Balkans and Finland, highlighting the inherent limits of their spheres of influence and confirming the transient nature of their accord. The unspoken truth was that to totalitarian powers, both driven by expansionist goals and both requiring the same limited resources and territory for future empires, were destined for conflict. The only remaining question was when and who would strike first. Despite the growing evidence of this impending catastrophe, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, clung with catastrophic, willful obstinacy to the belief that war in 1941 was simply impossible. His conviction was rooted in a deeply flawed analysis, mixing Marxist dogma with profound personal paranoia. Stalin believed that Germany, engaged in the ongoing air war with Britain and requiring time to fully integrate the resources of conquered Western Europe, would not dare open a massive new front until at least 1942, or possibly 1943. He was confident that Hitler would strictly adhere to the terms of the agreement, if only to prevent a strategic disaster on the eastern flank. This deeply flawed political assessment led to the most colossal intelligence failure in Soviet history, setting the stage for the disastrous military unpreparedness that followed. Throughout the spring of 1941, the warnings delivered to the Soviet High Command Stavka became relentless, precise, and utterly overwhelming. Allied governments, most notably Britain under Winston Churchill, who was desperate to see his isolated nation gain a new continental ally, passed on specific, verifiable intelligence detailing the massive German troop buildup along the border. Richard Sorge, the highly placed Soviet spy operating within the German embassy in Tokyo, provided exact warnings regarding the attack date. Soviet military reconnaissance reports, often confirming the presence of hundreds of thousands of German troops, tanks, and aircraft amassing near the border, were consistently sent up the chain of command. Yet, every single piece of this alarming, crucial intelligence was either dismissed, ignored, or actively suppressed by Stalin himself. The Soviet leader became convinced that these warnings were nothing more than a cynical Anglo-American plot, a deliberate provocation designed to damage the Soviet-German pact and lure the Soviet Union into a premature war with Germany, thereby saving Britain from invasion. Any military commander or intelligence officer who dared present evidence contradicting Stalin's fixed belief that the agreement will be honored was branded a defeatist, a British spy, or a provocateur, often facing immediate arrest and execution. This political paranoia resulted in devastating military consequences. Although the Soviet Union possessed immense military manpower and was rapidly producing new aircraft and tanks, Stalin's deep, fundamental distrust led to catastrophic military dispositions. Soviet forces were defensively deployed in vulnerable, exposed positions immediately along the pre-1939 border, lacking strategic depth and relying on an ill-conceived, politically charged doctrine that stated, "The war will be fought on enemy territory." No defensive lines were built far in the rear, no strategic retreats were planned, and the vast, powerful Soviet Air Force was tragically concentrated in highly vulnerable, uncamouflaged formations on airfields within striking distance of the border, making them perfect targets for the inevitable German opening strike. The rigid adherence to Stalin's faulty political assessment ensured that when the massive German attack finally came, the Soviet forces would be caught completely off balance, unable to mobilize, unable to communicate, and positioned perfectly to be encircled and destroyed by the devastating tactics of the German attack. The price of this profound denial would be paid in the blood of millions of soldiers and civilians. With the political decision to destroy the Soviet Union solidified by the end of 1940, the German High Command OKW transformed Hitler's ideological imperative into a detailed, massive military blueprint. This plan, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was formally laid out in Leader's Directive No. 21, issued on December 18, 1940. This document defined the strategic scope, the specific operational goals, and the immense geographical and logistical challenges of the Eastern Campaign. The directive was clear and unequivocal. The objective was not merely to defeat the Soviet army, but to achieve a complete and final victory over the Soviet state in a single, massive summer and autumn campaign, a true lightning war that would conclude before the onset of the brutal Russian winter. The operational strategy was built entirely upon the proven tactics of the lightning war: massive, deep penetration by armored forces, supported by overwhelming air power, designed to create large encirclements, or cauldrons, that would destroy the Soviet army along the frontier. The entire German invasion force was a colossal assembly, numbering over 3 million men, supported by over 3,350 tanks and 7,200 large artillery pieces. This force was organized into 3 primary army groups, each assigned a specific geographical corridor, a distinct strategic objective, and a unique, ambitious timeline for victory. The allocation of men and armor to these 3 prongs reflected the German belief that the key Soviet defensive forces and political centers lay along these 3 separate axes of advance. The northernmost formation was Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lepp. This force was the smallest of the 3, but was assigned a mission of immense political and naval significance. Its geographical corridor spanned the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, a relatively open area of operations. Its ultimate strategic objective was the ancient city of Leningrad. The seizure of Leningrad was considered vital for 2 primary reasons. First, to destroy the symbolic birthplace of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and a major center of Russian culture and industry, and second, to link up with the Finnish forces who were prepared to re-enter the war alongside Germany, thereby securing the German northern flank and eliminating the threat posed by the Soviet Baltic Fleet. The Germans expected rapid initial progress through the Baltic territories, but the subsequent advance on Leningrad itself, which was heavily defended, was anticipated to be difficult. In the center, poised for the decisive thrust, was Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, a veteran of the successful campaigns in Poland and France. This group was the largest and most powerful of the 3, receiving the majority of the German armored divisions including the crucial Guderian and Hoth panzer groups. Its strategic objective was nothing less than the Soviet capital, Moscow. The German High Command correctly identified that Moscow was the political, military, logistical, and railway hub of the entire Soviet defense system. They believed that the fall of Moscow would trigger the final political collapse of the Soviet state. The plan for Army Group Center involved massive encirclements first, around Minsk, and second, around Smolensk before launching the final, decisive assault on the capital. The sheer concentration of German power in this central axis made the advance towards Moscow the main military priority of the entire operation. To the south, the forces were led by Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. The mission of this group was primarily economic and was complicated by the presence of a strong Soviet force and the rugged geography of the region. Its strategic objectives were the conquest of Ukraine and the seizure of the immensely vital economic assets in the south. These included the vast agricultural wealth of the Ukrainian breadbasket, essential for German food security, and, most crucially, the capture of the industrial region of the Donets Basin and, ultimately, the oil fields of the Caucasus. The seizure of the Caucasus oil fields was viewed as the long-term economic key to winning the entire war, freeing Germany from its reliance on imports. To aid its mission, Army Group South was bolstered by the participation of Romanian and Hungarian forces, and its initial campaign focused on eliminating the strong Soviet forces defending Ukraine and advancing toward the Black Sea. The timeline for these ambitious objectives was incredibly aggressive. The German High Command predicted that the Red Army would be decisively destroyed within 8 to 10 weeks, with major cities like Leningrad and Moscow falling by the onset of October. This belief was founded on the assumption that the Soviet state, brittle and weakened by Stalin's purges, would collapse politically and militarily once its initial defensive layers were breached. This aggressive timetable, however, critically failed to account for the immense distances involved, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the catastrophic onset of the Russian winter misjudgment that would ultimately prove fatal to the entire operation. As the colossal German invasion force meticulously finalized its deployment along the vast frontier, the state of the Soviet military establishment, the Red Army presented a picture of immense, yet fatally flawed, potential. The Soviet Union commanded staggering resources in terms of manpower and was undeniably a massive industrial power. By June 1941, the Red Army numbered approximately 5 million men under arms, with a staggering reserve capacity, and its factories were producing tanks and aircraft at volumes that dwarfed Germany's output. The Soviet Union possessed more tanks and aircraft than any other nation in the world. Officially, its inventory included over 20,000 tanks and roughly 7,000 modern combat aircraft. This seemingly overwhelming strength, however, was brittle, deeply disorganized, and dangerously mismanaged, setting the stage for the catastrophic initial defeats. The primary, most devastating factor undermining the Soviet military was the pervasive and recent damage inflicted by Joseph Stalin's political purges. Beginning in the late 1930s, the purges had been a campaign of terror aimed at eliminating perceived political enemies within the Communist Party and, critically, within the military high command. The purge of the military was particularly savage. 3 out of the 5 field marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, 57 out of 85 corps commanders, and 110 out of 195 division commanders, roughly 80% of all high-ranking officers, were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. This wholesale slaughter of the most experienced leadership meant that by 1941, the vast majority of Soviet divisions were commanded by young, politically reliable, yet utterly inexperienced officers. These new commanders were terrified of making independent decisions, lacked the critical strategic judgment needed for fluid mobile warfare, and were generally incapable of handling large unit movements under the unexpected stress of the German attack. The purges had effectively decapitated the intellectual and strategic core of the Red Army, leaving the massive machine to be driven by fear and inexperience, beyond the crisis of leadership. The Soviet forces suffered from a disastrous forward deployment dictated entirely by Stalin's rigid political delusion that Germany would not attack in 1941. Instead of building strong, deep defensive lines in the rear to absorb the expected German lightning war thrusts, the vast majority of Soviet formations were ordered into vulnerable, exposed positions immediately along the western border. This deployment strategy lacked any meaningful strategic depth and was based on an ill-conceived, politically charged doctrine that stated, the war will be fought only on enemy territory. This belief meant that Soviet forces were clustered in large, static armies ready for an immediate counteroffensive, but they lacked the necessary fortifications and reserves to withstand a sudden, massive defensive assault. Furthermore, the condition of the Soviet Air Force was critically vulnerable. Although possessing overwhelming numbers of planes, the aircraft were largely concentrated in highly exposed, easily identifiable formations on airfields within striking distance of the border, lacking adequate camouflage, protective shelters, or effective anti-aircraft defense. This deployment, based on the assumption that Soviet planes would be used for immediate offensive strikes against Germany, tragically made them perfect, static targets for the German Air Force's opening surprise attack. Thousands of Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground within the first hours of the invasion. Finally, the entire Soviet command and communication structure was fatally centralized and rigid. The Dowding-style radar system that had proven so vital in the Battle of Britain was virtually non-existent or ignored. Communication relied heavily on fixed landlines, which were the first targets of the German Air Force's lightning strikes. Once these lines were severed, the inexperienced Soviet field commanders were cut off from Moscow, unable to receive orders, coordinate with neighboring units, or report the chaos of the front line. This systemic vulnerability, a direct result of political paranoia overriding sound military strategy, ensured that the immense Soviet military force, despite its vast numbers, would be unable to mobilize effectively and would instead be caught perfectly positioned to be encircled and destroyed by the devastating armored tactics of the German attack. The immense, meticulously planned apparatus of Operation Barbarossa was unleashed upon the Soviet Union on Sunday, June 22, 1941. The operation commenced in the pre-dawn hours, marking the precise moment when the cynical non-aggression agreement of 1939 was finally shattered. This day remains a profound, searing scar on the collective memory of the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian people, representing the sudden, brutal commencement of the most destructive theater of the entire global conflict. The entire strategic premise of the German attack hinged upon achieving absolute surprise, total speed, and overwhelming concentration of force, aiming to decapitate the Soviet defense before it could even begin to mobilize its vast potential. The attack was launched simultaneously along an immense front stretching over 1,800 miles, nearly 3,000 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea in the north down to the Black Sea in the south. The sheer scale of the initial assault was unprecedented in military history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by the forces of Germany's Axis allies, including Romanian, Hungarian, and Finnish troops, surged across the border, striking the Soviet positions with devastating synchronicity. This colossal force was marshaled into the three primary army groups north, center, and south, each aiming at its distinct strategic objective, Leningrad, Moscow, and the economic wealth of Ukraine and the Caucasus. The vital, immediate opening phase was dominated by the terrifying efficiency of the German Air Force. The German Air Force's opening move was not random bombing, but a highly coordinated, systematic assault on the heart of Soviet air power, utilizing the catastrophic deployment error of the Soviet command, which had clustered its aircraft on exposed, uncamouflaged airfields close to the frontier. The German planes launched a massive series of surprise attacks, targeting over 60 major Soviet airfields within the first few hours. The results were immediate and devastating. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground, often before their pilots could even reach their cockpits. This single, brutal opening action secured the German forces almost complete air supremacy over the crucial northern and central invasion sectors. Without the ability to challenge the German planes, the Soviet ground forces were left blind, defenseless against air reconnaissance, and subject to relentless dive bomber attacks, a crippling disadvantage that sealed the fate of the frontier armies. On the ground, the German mechanized divisions, the elite armored corps, immediately demonstrated the superior tactical doctrine of the Lightning War. The attack formations quickly bypassed forward Soviet fortifications and frontier posts, using their speed and maneuverability to strike at the weakly defended rear. The German forces' ability to coordinate armored breakthroughs with infantry support and immediate air strikes proved overwhelming. The Soviet command structure, already crippled by the political purges and relying on vulnerable wired communication lines, instantly collapsed under the shock and pressure. German engineers systematically destroyed the rail and communication hubs, completing the paralysis of the Soviet response. Field commanders, already terrified of making unauthorized decisions due to Stalin's paranoia, were cut off from Moscow, unable to coordinate any meaningful counteroffensive or even authorize strategic retreats. The chaos along the entire front was total. The initial days saw terrifying successes for the invaders. German armored spearheads, driving sometimes 50 miles 80 kilometers per day, carved immense holes in the Soviet front line, executing the planned encirclement maneuvers with ruthless efficiency. The isolated, static Soviet armies, positioned too far forward without any strategic depth, found themselves quickly surrounded in vast pockets, known later as cauldrons. These initial weeks resulted in the capture of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and the destruction of thousands of tanks and guns. The immense scale of this early defeat seemed to validate Hitler's belief that the Soviet state was a rotten structure that would collapse instantly upon receiving a decisive blow. The speed and success of the initial attack gave the German forces profound momentum, thrusting them deep into Soviet territory and setting the initial course for what the German High Command hoped would be a swift, decisive campaign ending before the onset of winter. The war's first hours were a testament to the tactical genius of the German planners and the catastrophic cost of Stalin's political denial. The immense, synchronized attack launched on June 22, 1941, was immediately followed by a period of military triumph for the German forces that mirrored, and often exceeded, the speed and scope of the victories seen in France. The initial, devastating success confirmed the German High Command's faith in their core doctrine, the Lightning War tactic of deep armored penetration, known for its emphasis on speed, surprise, and decisive encirclement. The vast, open plains of the Eastern Front, in contrast to the dense terrain of the West, proved ideally suited for the operational mobility of the German tank divisions, resulting in the creation of massive pockets of trapped Soviet forces, tragically referred to as cauldrons. The central and most critical axis of the entire campaign belonged to Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. This group, possessing the majority of the powerful armored formations under aggressive generals like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, was tasked with the immense responsibility of destroying the main Soviet forces and racing toward the capital, Moscow. Their initial objective was the major Soviet defense concentration near the city of Minsk. The armored thrusts here were relentless. Guderian's tanks, ignoring the chaos of the immediate front lines, drove hundreds of miles into the Soviet rear. They moved so rapidly that they often severed communication lines before the Soviet High Command even realized their army groups were fully encircled. The speed of the attack quickly rendered the forward Soviet defenses irrelevant. The first great encirclement battle took place around Białystok and Minsk within the first week of the invasion. The Soviet forces, deployed statically too far forward and rigidly adhering to orders that forbade retreat, were caught perfectly in the German trap. The armored pincers of Army Group Center rapidly closed behind them. The resulting cauldron trapped an immense concentration of Soviet forces, several entire armies. The fighting within the pocket was desperate, brutal, and often disorganized, as Soviet command and control had completely collapsed. The final result was catastrophic for the Soviets. The encirclement led to the capture of over 324,000 Soviet soldiers, the destruction of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and the total operational elimination of the Soviet Western Front as a cohesive fighting force. The German advance had penetrated over 200 miles, 320 kilometers, deep into Soviet territory in less than a fortnight. A military feat unprecedented in history. The speed and success of this initial phase, however, carried critical risks and generated strategic arguments within the German command. The tanks were moving so fast that they often left their supporting infantry and essential supply lines far behind, creating dangerously exposed flanks and straining the limited German logistics network. This strategic overextension led to one of the most famous and complex arguments of the entire campaign. As Army Group Center prepared to launch its next major encirclement, the final drive toward the major Soviet city of Smolensk, Hitler and the top generals began to clash over the primary objective. The aggressive armored generals, Guderian and Hoth, fiercely advocated for a direct, uninterrupted race toward Moscow, believing the Soviet state was on the verge of political collapse and that only the capital's immediate capture could guarantee the swift victory predicted in the initial plan. In contrast, Hitler, influenced by the need for economic resources and strategic security, began to divert forces. He argued that before attacking Moscow, the German front needed to secure its flanks and eliminate the remaining resource centers. Specifically, he sought to shift armored divisions from the center, some north to assist with the crucial, but stalled, capture of Leningrad, and some south to help secure the economically vital Ukrainian territory. This strategic indecision, which prioritized capturing territory and resources over the direct, uninterrupted destruction of the enemy army in the center, was the first significant internal deviation from the original plan. While the Battle of Smolensk would ultimately result in another immense victory, capturing over 300,000 more Soviet troops and opening the door to Moscow, the brief but vital delay caused by this strategic argument cost the German army precious weeks of good summer weather, a cost that would be measured in ultimate strategic failure months later. The collapse of the Soviet defense in the center was complete, but the Soviet state, though severely wounded, refused to die. While the central axis of the invasion under Army Group Center was executing massive encirclements that captured hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the northernmost thrust of Operation Barbarossa was equally swift and strategically vital. This was the mission of Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lepp, whose force was the smallest of the three major prongs, but was assigned a task of immense political and strategic weight: the seizure of the ancient city of Leningrad. This campaign aimed to achieve immediate strategic objectives, secure the entire northern flank of the German advance, and link up with Germany's Nordic allies. The initial phase of the northern push was marked by the incredible speed of the advanced German motorized forces. Army Group North's geographical corridor spanned the three Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia regions that had only recently been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet sphere. The population in these occupied territories often harbored intense anti-Soviet sentiment, which initially benefited the German invasion. The German forces advanced rapidly through the open terrain, capitalizing on the political disarray and the lack of prepared Soviet defensive positions. The primary armored spearhead, led by General Erich Haipner's mechanized group, was relentless. It tore through the Soviet Northwest Front, shattering the disorganized Soviet defense units stationed near the border and overwhelming local resistance. The speed was breathtaking. The armored columns covered vast distances in the first weeks, achieving penetration depths and daily advances that stunned the Soviet high command. The strategic momentum allowed Army Group North to swiftly capture the capital of Lithuania, Vilnius, and the capital of Latvia, Riga, effectively securing the majority of the Baltic region within the first month of the war. The swift conquest of these territories accomplished several critical goals. It provided Germany with crucial ports along the Baltic Sea, eliminating the immediate threat from the Soviet Baltic Fleet and securing the Reich's northern flank. However, The advance soon encountered escalating resistance. The German forces pushed deeper into ethnically Russian territory and closed in on their final objective. The ultimate target of Army Group North was Leningrad. The seizure of this city, the historical capital of the Russian Empire and the symbolic birthplace of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, was considered vital by Hitler. Its destruction would serve as a powerful political and psychological blow, and its capture would allow Germany to link up definitively with Finnish forces advancing from the north, securing the vital land bridge between the German and Finnish fronts. As the German forces approached the city, the Soviet defense stiffened considerably. The terrain grew more difficult, characterized by forests, lakes, and marshes, which severely slowed the pace of the German armored divisions. By late August and early September 1941, Army Group North had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. However, the logistical strain of the extended advance, combined with surprisingly tenacious Soviet resistance and the redeployment of critical Soviet units, slowed the German advance to a crawl. The city was surrounded from the south by German forces and from the north by Finnish forces, but the German high command was unable to mount the final, decisive assault to take the city itself. Hitler, perhaps swayed by his desire to preserve German manpower or driven by a cold, calculated decision to simply starve the city into submission, issued a catastrophic order. The city was not to be taken, but encircled and annihilated through prolonged siege. The subsequent siege of Leningrad, which began in early September, was a deliberate act of annihilation and became one of the longest, most brutal, and most tragic sieges in human history. The city was completely cut off from the mainland, save for a narrow route across the frozen Lake Ladoga in winter, known as the Road of Life. The German forces maintained a tight cordon, subjecting the city to constant, devastating artillery shelling and relentless aerial bombardment. The nearly 900-day siege resulted in the death of over 1 million Soviet civilians, primarily from starvation, cold, and disease. This deliberate decision to prioritize annihilation over conquest tragically diverted a massive number of German troops, who were tied down maintaining the siege and could have been used in the crucial, final push against Moscow. The northern campaign succeeded in securing the German flank and capturing vast territory, but the failure to capture Leningrad decisively meant that the massive strategic objective was only half fulfilled, leaving a stubborn pocket of resistance that would drain German resources for years. While Army Group Center drove relentlessly toward Moscow and Army Group North became bogged down in the marshes and woods surrounding Leningrad, the southernmost thrust of Operation Barbarossa was equally vital, driven primarily by critical economic objectives. This was the mission of Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. This force, while possessing fewer armored divisions than the Central Group, was reinforced by Romanian and Hungarian Allied forces and was assigned the immense task of conquering Ukraine and seizing the critical economic resources located in the south. The strategic objectives for the Southern Group were threefold, all anchored in Germany's long-term economic survival. First, the seizure of the vast, incredibly fertile plains of Ukraine. The so-called breadbasket was absolutely essential to secure German food supplies and relieve the acute resource shortages plaguing the Reich. Second, the capture of the Donets Basin, a major industrial and coal mining region, was necessary to boost German war production. Third, and most critically for the entire war, the group was tasked with advancing toward the ultimate prize, the oil fields of the Caucasus region, which Hitler deemed indispensable for fueling his global ambitions. The advance of Army Group South, however, proved to be far more complicated and strategically challenging than the relatively easy drives seen in the north and center. The Soviet forces facing von Rundstedt were more numerous, generally better equipped, and often commanded by more experienced officers than those facing the central thrust. The terrain was also less conducive to the relentless speed of the armored advance, though the flat steppes of Ukraine initially provided good ground for mechanized warfare. The first great encounter in the south developed into a series of massive armored battles, the largest of the war's opening weeks near the cities of Brody Lutsk, and Rovno. The Soviet counterattacks here were immense, featuring thousands of tanks, often the superior KV and T-30 from models that the Germans had never encountered. These battles, though ultimately won by the Germans through better coordination and air support, slowed the initial pace and demonstrated that the resistance in the south would be far tougher. As the German army pushed deep into Ukraine in July and August 1941, the first massive encirclement battles defined the campaign. The Soviet command, still crippled by lack of strategic foresight and Stalin's insistence on holding every piece of ground, allowed large formations to be bypassed. One of the most devastating encirclements occurred around the city of Uman. A massive German pincer movement trapped several Soviet armies, resulting in the surrender or capture of over 100,000 Soviet soldiers. The brutality of the fighting, combined with the extreme heat of the Ukrainian summer and the deliberate ruthlessness of the German forces, turned these early cauldrons into scenes of unprecedented suffering. The culmination of the initial southern campaign was the massive battle for Kiev, the historic capital of Ukraine and a critical industrial hub. Kiev was defended by the entire Soviet Southwestern Front, a massive concentration of force under the command of Marshal Semyon Budyny. By late August, the German advance had created a deep bulge in the Soviet lines. However, instead of allowing the armored forces to continue their drive eastward toward the Donets Basin and the Caucasus, Hitler made a highly controversial and strategically pivotal decision. Influenced by the success of the encirclements and the urging of Field Marshal Keitel, Hitler ordered the temporary diversion of powerful armored divisions, most notably Guderian's tank group from Army Group Center, to swing south to assist in the encirclement of the Soviet forces around Kiev. This decision, aimed at eliminating the immense enemy concentration and securing the vast resources of Ukraine before winter, created a catastrophic delay in the central drive toward Moscow. The pincer movement, executed by the diverted Central Forces and the Southern Group, closed decisively in mid-September. The Kiev encirclement was perhaps the largest single battle of encirclement in history. The result was a catastrophic, devastating defeat for the Soviet Union. Over 665,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled, killed, or captured. The elimination of these forces secured Ukraine's capital and its agricultural heartland for the German regime, fulfilling the crucial economic objective of the campaign. However, the cost of this immense victory was strategic time. The delay to achieve the Kiev encirclement was crucial for weeks of precious good weather that the German forces could ill afford to lose before launching their final, delayed assault on Moscow. The victory in Ukraine was decisive, but came at a price that guaranteed the eventual failure of the entire Barbarossa operation. The immense, destructive success of the Kiev encirclement in September 1941 secured the German forces vital economic resources in Ukraine, but the victory came at a catastrophic strategic cost, a 4-week delay. This precious loss of time, mandated by Hitler's decision to prioritize resource security over the direct assault on the Soviet capital, ensured that the final, decisive attack on Moscow, the ultimate political and military prize of the entire campaign, would be launched perilously late in the year. The German High Command desperately knew that time was no longer on their side. The final German offensive aimed at the Soviet capital was codenamed Operation Typhoon. The operation, launched on October 2, 1941, was massive, committing the full weight of Army Group Center and its primary tank formations, now returned from the south, against the severely weakened Soviet defenses. The plan was executed with the sheer force that defined the Lightning War. The initial strikes were devastating. The German forces quickly achieved major, spectacular encirclement victories at Vyazma and Bryansk. These colossal pockets resulted in the capture or destruction of over 660,000 Soviet soldiers, eliminating the last major organized Soviet field forces standing between the German armies and Moscow. The sheer scale of the defeat was staggering, creating a vast, temporary vacuum in the defense, and signaling to the world that the capture of the capital was imminent. The psychological impact of these defeats within the Soviet high command and within Moscow itself was immense, bordering on panic. The Soviet leadership was forced into desperate, immediate action. Joseph Stalin himself remained in Moscow, a decision of immense political and moral significance to rally the remaining forces. The Soviet command hastily scraped together every available reserve unit, including Siberian divisions and naval infantry, and poured them into the defense of the capital. Crucially, they employed a massive program of civilian mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of Moscow's citizens, mostly women, children, and elderly men, were organized to dig vast, complex anti-tank ditches and defensive fortifications around the city's perimeter. The battle for Moscow had transitioned from a mobile campaign into a brutal, final siege. However, as the German forces pressed forward from mid-October, the initial euphoria of the massive encirclements quickly gave way to the harsh, unforgiving realities of the Russian landscape and climate. The primary strategic enemy was no longer the Soviet army, but the Russian land itself. The onset of the severe autumnal weather brought the infamous Rasputits of the roadlessness, or season of thick, liquid mud, to the vast Russian plains. Continuous heavy rains transformed the unpaved roads and open fields into thick, viscous quagmires. The effect on the German advance was immediate and crippling. The motorized corps of the German army, the trucks, artillery haulers, and even the tank tracks became hopelessly bogged down. Supply lines, already strained by the immense distances covered since June, ground to a halt. Fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing could not be delivered to the front-line forces, and the planned lightning speed of the offensive was reduced to a miserable, agonizing crawl. Despite the mud, the German leadership, driven by Hitler's fanatical belief in victory and the absolute necessity of capturing Moscow before the onset of true winter, refused to halt the attack. The German soldiers, many of whom still wore only their summer uniforms due to logistical failures, fought forward through the mud and the rapidly dropping temperatures. By late November, a brief return of hard frost allowed the ground to harden, and the final, desperate German push commenced. This attack brought the German advanced units to within 20 miles, 30 kilometers of the Kremlin itself, close enough to see the distant spires of the city. The extreme, close proximity to the ultimate goal, however, was the high water mark of the entire operation. The advance stalled completely in the early days of December 1941. The final factors in the German strategic defeat were the arrival of new, fresh, highly effective Siberian and Far Eastern Soviet Reserve Divisions units that were experienced in cold weather warfare, and the catastrophic onset of the truly brutal Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to below -40°C. The German army's equipment, designed for Western European conditions, froze solid, lubricants turned to wax, fuel lines cracked, and weapons became inoperable. The German forces, exhausted, undersupplied, and severely exposed to the elements, were caught in the most desperate possible situation, paralyzed at the gates of the enemy capital. On December 5, 1941, the tables were suddenly and violently turned. The Soviet forces, utilizing their fresh reserves, superior cold weather gear, and intimate knowledge of the terrain, launched a massive, coordinated counteroffensive that smashed the overextended German flanks. This forced the German army into its first major, mass retreat of the entire war. Operation Typhoon had failed, and with it, the entire premise of the quick victory under Operation Barbarossa collapsed. The war in the East, which Hitler had guaranteed would be won in one summer, had now devolved into a brutal, protracted war of attrition, a war Germany was fundamentally unprepared and unable to win. The catastrophic failure of Operation Typhoon at the gates of Moscow, December 1941, marked the definitive and irreversible end of Operation Barbarossa's primary objective, the swift, total destruction of the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign. The coordinated Soviet counteroffensive, launched with fresh Siberian reserves and aided by the paralyzing severity of the Russian winter, forced the German army into its first major, mass retreat of the entire war. This moment was not just a tactical setback. It was a profound strategic defeat that fundamentally changed the nature and the duration of the entire global conflict. The war, which Hitler had audaciously guaranteed would be won in 8 to 10 weeks, had now devolved into a brutal, prolonged war of attrition, a war of material, manpower, and endurance that Germany was fundamentally unprepared and ultimately unable to win. Against the immense resources of the Soviet state, the failure of Operation Barbarossa stemmed from a confluence of deep-seated, critical strategic errors and fundamental miscalculations by the German High Command. The first failure was the fatal, inherent underestimation of Soviet resilience and resources. German military intelligence, blinded by ideological arrogance and memories of the Soviet military purges, severely underestimated the Soviet Union's capacity to absorb devastating initial losses and rapidly regenerate new armies from its deep reserve pool and massive industrial base. They were surprised by the sheer number of Soviet divisions and the resilience of Soviet command structures under extreme duress. The second fatal flaw was the strategic diversion of forces. Hitler's decision to temporarily halt the central drive toward Moscow in August to execute the massive encirclement around Kiev. This 4-week delay, though yielding an immense victory in terms of captured soldiers, was the crucial amount of time lost to the oncoming Rasputitsa, the season of thick mud, and the subsequent onset of the devastatingly cold winter. The third, crippling error was the logistical and technical failure to prepare for the Russian climate. The German war machine, meticulously engineered for the short, sharp campaigns of Western Europe, was wholly unprepared for the vast distances and the extreme cold of the East. The army lacked sufficient winter clothing, specialized cold weather lubricants for vehicles and weapons, and specialized infrastructure. As temperatures plummeted, German equipment froze solid, tank engines refused to start, rifle mechanisms jammed, and vital supplies were cut off by the frozen, impassable terrain. The German soldier was fighting an enemy he could not see. The Russian winter with inadequate preparation, a factor that destroyed more operational capacity than any single Soviet counterattack. The long-term consequences of the failure were immediate and global. The most immediate result was the creation of a sustained Eastern Front, which would quickly become the largest, most brutal, and most casualty-heavy theater of the entire war. From this point forward, the majority, roughly 75 to 80% of the German army's manpower and material resources, were permanently tied down in the desperate fight against the Soviet forces. This sustained drain on German resources relieved the immense pressure on Britain and freed up resources for the Western Allies. The Soviet Union, now firmly established as an active member of the Allied coalition, guaranteed that the war would not end in a negotiated peace as long as Moscow stood. Furthermore, the failure ensured the total commitment of the United States to the global conflict. The very day after the Soviet counteroffensive began its decisive pushback from Moscow, December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war. The fact that the Soviet Union was successfully engaging and pushing back the bulk of the German army meant that the United States could prioritize the war against Japan in the Pacific, knowing that their greatest European adversary was facing its own existential crisis in the East. Finally, the operation cemented the horrific ideological nature of the German war effort. The campaign against the Soviet Union was characterized by unparalleled brutality, culminating in the widespread execution of Soviet prisoners of war and civilians, and the active deployment of the mobile killing squads, accelerating the systematic implementation of the Holocaust and the atrocities associated with the German ambition for Lebensraum. The invasion of the East was a war of extermination, and its ultimate failure guaranteed the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. By failing to achieve its lighting victory in 1941, Germany condemned itself to a two-front war of attrition that it could not possibly win.